The observation station hung in the cold darkness of space like a giant metal eye, watching the world below. Had been there for 15 cycles, spinning slowly in orbit around the green and brown planet called Velis 4. Inside the station, hundreds of officers worked day and night monitoring every movement on the surface below. Watched the creatures graze and the plants grow and the seasons change. They recorded everything with the patience of immortals. This was their purpose. This was their duty to watch and learn and never interfere. Commander Rilo stood before the massive viewing screen with his forearms folded behind his back. His gray skin reflected the soft blue light of the monitors around him, and his large dark eyes stared at the planet below. Without blinking, he had been commander of this station for 5 cycles now, and in all that time nothing interesting had ever happened. The creatures below wandered and ate and slept, and sometimes died. The plants grew and withered. With the changing seasons, the weather shifted from warm to cold and back again. It was all very predictable. Veryborn Grillo was over 400 years old, and he had seen many things in his long life. He had watched stars being born and planets being formed. He had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations. He had studied species that had conquered the stars and species that had never left their homeworlds, but this assignment was the most tedious of his entire career ever happened on Velis, for the planet was classified as a Category 3 world, which meant it could support life, but just barely. The atmosphere was thin and cold, with less oxygen than most species needed to survive comfortably. The native plants were barely edible, and the water sources were scattered and difficult to find. It was not the kind of world that attracted attention. It was not the kind of world that anyone would want to visit in. That was exactly why the Galactic Survey Corps had chosen it for observation. Wanted to study how life developed on a marginal world. They wanted to understand the limits of biological adaptation. They wanted answers to questions that most species never thought to ask. Grillo understood the scientific value of this work, but understanding something and enjoying it were two very different things. He was thinking about requesting a transfer to a more interesting assignment when the alarm began to scream. A red light flashed across every screen in the observation deck. Officers jumped from their seats and rushed to their consoles. Voices called out readings and coordinates and warnings, and in the center of it all, Rilo stood perfectly still, watching the chaos unfold around him. Officer Temi was the first to reach her station. Was young for their species, barely 100 years old, and still full of the energy and enthusiasm that Rilo had lost long ago. Her pale fingers danced across the controls as she pulled up sensor data and tracking information. Her eyes widened as she processed what she was seeing. "Sir," she called out, "we have an unregistered vessel entering the atmosphere." Rilo turned sharply and moved to stand beside her, his eyes fixed on the screen where a small dot was falling through the sky of Velis. For it was trailing fire and smoke behind it like a dying comet plummeting toward the surface below. "What is it?" he demanded. Temi worked furiously at her console, pulling up every database she could access. The vessel was small and crude, built with a kind of desperate functionality that spoke of a species more concerned with survival than elegance. It was not elegant or beautiful like the ships of the elder races. It was angular and practical and somehow defiant, as if it had been built by creatures who refused to accept their limitations. After a long moment, Temi looked up at Rilo with an expression he did not understand. It was something between fear and fascination. "It is a human vessel," sir. The word spread through the observation deck like a cold wind. Every officer stopped what they were doing and turned to look at the screens. Conversations died mid-sentence. Semuments froze mid-step. For a long moment, the only sound was the blaring of the alarm. Humans Rilo had heard of them. Of course, everyone in the galaxy had heard of them by now. They were the youngest species to achieve spaceflight, and they had done it in a way that baffled and disturbed the older civilizations. Species took millions of years to crawl from their birth worlds to the stars. They evolved slowly and carefully, developing technology and careful, measured steps. They learned from their mistakes and refined their methods over countless generations. Was the natural order of things. It was the way the universe worked. Humans had done it in less than 10,000 years. They had gone from primitive hunters to interstellar travelers in what felt like the blink of an eye. They had skipped steps and ignored limitations and pushed forward with a recklessness that terrified. The elder race's end. Now they were everywhere, spreading across the galaxy, like a wildfire that could not be contained. They were small and fragile and lived such short lives that most species pitied a human might live for 80 or 90 cycles. At most, while Rello himself was over 400 and still considered middle-aged, what could such a brief existence teach anyone? What wisdom could be gained in so little time? How could a species that lived and died so quickly ever hope to understand the universe? And yet the humans spread. They spread faster than anyone expected. They colonized worlds that should have killed them. They built cities in places where no sane species would try to survive. They adapted and evolved and refused to accept defeat. They were a puzzle that the elder races could not solve. The Galactic Council had placed them under observation until their true nature could be determined. Were they a threat or an opportunity? Were they allies or enemies? No one knew for certain. Now one of their ships was crashing onto Velis for Relo, which did happen with a mixture of dread and curiosity. The vessel struck the northern basin with a tremendous impact that sent dust and debris flying into the air. The ground shook from the force of the collision. A cloud of smoke and fire rose into the purple sky. For a long moment there was only silence and stillness on the screens. Then Temi spoke again, and her voice was quiet. I am detecting one life sign. Sid is weak, but stable. One survivorillo. Considered this information carefully. He had read the reports about humans. He knew they were fragile and short-lived and dependent on very specific environmental conditions. Flisfer was not suited to their biology. The atmosphere was too thin, the temperature was too cold, the food sources were inadequate. A single human stranded there with no support and no resources would not last long. How long until the nearest human vessel can respond to a distress signal? Temi checked her calculations, running the numbers through her console of 48 standard hours at minimum, assuming anyone even receives the signal. Rilla nodded slowly. 48 hours to full days by human reckoning. A significant amount of time for a creature with such a short lifespan, but probably not enough to make a difference. He looked at the crash site on the screen and watched as a small figure pulled itself from the wreckage. Though human was alive for now. Activate full observation protocol, he ordered. I want every sensor focused on that crash site. Document everything, every movement, every action, every decision the human makes. The Galactic Council will want to know exactly how long a human survives alone on a Category 3 world. He expected to record a slow and painful death. He expected to watch the humans struggle and fail and eventually succumb to the hostile environment. He expected to add another data point to the growing file on human fragility. He had no idea what he was about to witness. Far below on the surface of Velis, for a woman named Una dragged herself out of her ruined shuttle and collapsed onto the rocky ground. Every part of her body hurt. Her head was bleeding from a cut above her left eye. Where she had struck the console during the crash, her ribs ached with every breath, and she suspected at least one of them was cracked. Her left arm was badly bruised from the impact, and her fingers tingled with numbness. She lay there for a long moment, staring up at the pale purple sky and wondering if this was how she was going to die, alone on a world she had never seen before, surrounded by nothing but rocks and silence. No family to hold her hand, no friends to say goodbye, just cold, empty alien sky stretching endlessly above her. She thought about her mother back on the colony, a world where she had grown up. Her mother who had taught her to plant seeds and tend gardens and coax life from reluctant soil. She thought about her father, who had shown her how to fix engines and repair broken machines and build useful things from nothing but scraps. She thought about her grandmother, who would pass down recipes and traditions and the ancient knowledge of fermentation. All those lessons, all those memories, all those people who had shaped her into who she was, were they going to? And here in this cold and empty place, Una lay still and listened to her own breathing. Sounded wrong in this thin atmosphere, labored and shallowish. Breath required more effort than it should. She could feel her heart pounding and her chest working harder to circulate oxygen through her body. This was not a friendly world. This was not a place where humans were meant to live. But Una was not ready to die, not yet, not. Here she took a breath, it hurt. She took another, it hurt less, and then she pushed herself Up onto her knees and looked around at her situation. The shuttle was destroyed. Main hull had cracked open on impact, and the engine compartment was a smoking ruin, fuel leaked from ruptured lines and sparks danced across damaged circuits there. Would be no flying out of here whatever happened next. She was stuck on this world. She checked her emergency beacon and found it crushed beyond repair. Housing was shattered, and the internal components were scattered across the ground. No signal would be going out from this device. No. One would know she was here. No one was coming to rescue her, not unless another ship happened to pass through this sector, and that could take days or weeks or never. She was alone. She had no shelter beyond the wreckage of her ship. She had no food beyond whatever remained in her emergency supplies. She had no water purification system, no medical equipment beyond a basic first aid kit, no weapons, no communication, no hope of rescue. The temperature was already dropping. As the sun sank toward the horizon, she could see frost forming on some of the rocks. Around hearthen nights on this world would be cold enough to kill an unprotected human. Most people would have panicked in this situation. Most people would have sat down and cried and waited for death to find them. Most people would have given up. Yuna was not most people. She stood up on shaking legs and wiped the blood from her face with the back of her hand. Cut on her forehead was not deep. It would heal on its own if she kept it clean. The bruises and the cracked rib were more serious, but not immediately life-threatening. She would survive the injuries. Question was whether she would survive everything else. She walked to the ruined cargo hold of her shuttle and began to take inventory. The shuttle had been carrying agricultural supplies to a colony world 3 systems away. Was a routine delivery mission, the kind of job she had done 100 times before. She had never expected anything to go wrong, but something had gone wrong. Micrometeorite had struck her engine at the worst possible moment. The damage had cascaded through her systems and sent her tumbling out of hyperspace and into the gravity well of this unnamed world. Now, here she was, stranded and alone with nothing but a cargo hold full of farming equipment. She looked at what she had. There were seeds of a dozen different varieties, fast-growing vegetables designed for colony worlds, hardy grains that could survive in poor soil, fruit-bearing plants that produced food quickly and reliably. There were soil samples and growing medium and fertilizer. There were tools for digging and planting and harvesting. There were polymer sheets and metal poles and connector pieces. There were water collection devices and filtration membranes and irrigation tubing. And in one corner, carefully packed and somehow still intact, there was a complete brewing system. She had been transporting it for a friend who ran a restaurant on the colony. It was a good system designed for small-scale production, but capable of handling a variety of fermentation processes. Her grandmother would have loved it. Tuna looked at everything she had, and she began to make a plan. Her father had taught her that survival was not about luck. It was about knowledge and preparation and the willingness to do whatever needed to be done. You cannot control what happens to you, he had told her when she was just a child, but you can control how you respond. The universe does not care about you. It will not save you. You have to save yourself. Yuna had never forgotten those words. She was not about to start ignoring them now. First, she needed shelter. The shuttle hull was broken, but some sections were still intact. Large pieces of metal plating could be salvaged and repurposed as polymer sheets from the cargo hold could be used for insulation and waterproofing. She spent the next 2 hours cutting and dragging and rearranging. Her muscles screamed with exhaustion. Her cracked ribs sent sharp pains through her chest with every movement, but she did not stop. Could not stop. Stopping meant dying. When she was done, she had something that resembled a small enclosed space. It was ugly and cramped and smelled of burned metal and leaked fuel, but it had walls and a roof and a floor. It would keep the wind out. It would trap some of her body heat. It would give her a chance to survive the night. She gathered the thermal blankets from her emergency supplies and wrapped herself inside her shelter. Though the sun had set and the temperature was dropping rapidly, she could see her breath misting in the cold air. She could feel the chill seeping through the walls of her makeshift home, but she was still alive. That was what mattered. She did not sleep that night. She could not sleep. Her mind was too busy calculating and planning and figuring out what she needed to do next. Water was her first priority. A human could survive for weeks without food, but only days without water. She needed to find a water source or create one before her small supply ran out. Food was her second priority. Her emergency rations would only last a few days. She needed to find a way to grow or gather Moran shelter. Her current shelter was temporary at best. She needed something better, something permanent, something that could protect her not just from the cold, but from whatever else this world might throw at hers. She lay there in the darkness, thinking and planning. She heard sounds outside her shelter, small sounds, movement and breathing, and the soft padding of feet on rocky ground. Something was out there, something alive, something watching. Yuna did not move. She barely breathed. She listened and waited and tried to understand what kind of creatures shared this world with her. The sounds circled her shelter once, and then twice, and then faded away into the night. Whatever was out there had decided she was not worth investigating, at least not tonight, but she had learned something important. She was not the only living thing on this world, and where there was life, there was opportunity. Far above in the observation station, Commander Rilo watched the humans settle into her makeshift shelter. He had expected her to panic when she heard the creatures approaching. He had expected her to flee or fight or make some foolish decision that would seal her fate. Instead, she had stayed perfectly still and silent. She had listened and waited and gathered information. She had controlled her fear instead of letting it control her. That was unexpected. That was interesting. Rilo turned to Temi, who was recording everything with wide and fascinated eyes. "Have we ever observed this species so closely before?" Temi shook her head without looking away from her screen. "No, sir. There are records of human activity on other worlds, but nothing like this. We have never had the opportunity to observe a human in a true survival situation." "Then we must not waste this opportunity, Rilo. So die. One continuous observation around the clock. Every action she takes, every decision she makes, everything she doesn't want to. Understand how this species thinks." He looked back at the screen where the human was now completely still and silent in her shelter. "We may learn something valuable," he said, "or we may simply watch her die. Either way, the Galactic Council will want to know." And so the watching began. The great and ancient species of the galaxy trained their eyes on one small, fragile human alone, on a hostile world with nothing but her wits and her will to survive. They expected to see weakness and failure and death. They expected to confirm everything they believed about this young and primitive species. They had no idea what was coming. They had no idea that in the next 48 hours their understanding of humanity would change forever, and by the time they understood what they were witnessing, it would be far too late to look away. The sun rose over Velisphore in shades of orange and gold, painting the rocky landscape in colors that Yuna had never seen before. She had not slept at all during the long cold night. Her body ached from the crash, and from the hours of hard labor that had followed. Her head still throbbed from the cut above her eye. Cracked ribs sent sharp pains through her chest every time she breathed too deeply, but none of that mattered now. She was alive. The sun was up, and she had work to do. She crawled out of her makeshift shelter and stood in the pale morning light, taking deep breaths of the thin, cold air. Atmosphere here had less oxygen than she was used to. Each breath felt insufficient. Movement required more effort than it should. Her heart was working overtime to keep her body functioning, but she had trained for situations like this. Years of preparation on colony worlds and space stations had taught her how to cope with hostile environments. She knew that her body would adapt if she gave it time. She knew that the discomfort was temporary. She knew that she could push through. The first thing she did was explore her surroundings. She walked in a wide circle around the crash site, memorizing the terrain and cataloging everything she saw. The northern basin was a rocky valley surrounded by low hills covered with strange vegetation. The plants were unlike anything she had seen before. Their leaves were thick and waxy colored in shades of purple and blue that seemed almost luminous in the morning light. Their stems were covered with fine, hair-like structures that waved gently even when there was no wind. They grew in clusters around certain areas, avoiding others for reasons she could not yet understand. She made mental notes of everything: the height of the hills, the direction of the prevailing wind, angle of the sunlight, the texture of the soil. All of it was information. All of it could be useful about 200 meters From her shelter, she found what she was looking for, a small pool of water fed by streams that trickled down from the surrounding hills. Water looked clear and clean, caught the sunlight and sparkled like a jewel set in the gray stone water. Most essential resource for any living thing, Yuna knelt beside the pool and examined it carefully, though. Water looked safe, but she knew better than to trust appearances there. Could be bacteria or parasites that her body had no defense against there. Could be chemical compounds that would make her sick. There could be toxins that would kill her slowly over days or weeks. She collected a sample in one of her containers and marked it for testing later. She would not drink from this pool until she was certain it was safe, but knowing it was here gave her options meant survival. She continued her exploration. Moving further from the crash site with each pass, the terrain became more varied as she walked. Rocky outcrops gave way to patches of soil-bare ground, gave way to fields of the strange purple vegetation, and in several places she noticed something interesting. The rock was warm, not hot enough to burn her, but noticeably warmer than the surrounding ground. She placed her hand against one of these warm patches and felt steady heat radiating up from below. Thermal vent. She remembered reading about them in her training manuals. Some planets had underground heat sources, volcanic activity, or radioactive decay that pushed warmth up through the rock. These thermal vents could create microclimates, little pockets of warmth where the temperature was much higher than the surrounding environment, and where there was warmth there was opportunity. Found the largest thermal vent about 300 meters from her shelter. It was a flat, rocky area about 20 meters across where the ground was warm to the touch. Even in the cold morning air, steam rose from small cracks in the rock. Air above it shimmered slightly with heat. This was where she would build. She returned to the crash site and began the hard work of salvaging materials. The shuttle was a mess of broken metal and shattered components, but there was still plenty of useful material. She found sections of hull plating that were intact enough to use as walls. She found metal poles that could serve as supports. She found connector pieces and fasteners and tools, and she found the polymer sheets from her cargo. Those sheets were designed for agricultural use on colony worlds. They were transparent enough to let sunlight through, were strong enough to withstand wind and rain. They were flexible enough to be shaped and molded. They were perfect for what she had in mind. She dragged everything to the thermal vent piece by piece. Took hours. Her muscles burned with exhaustion. Her cracked ribs screamed with every heavy lift. Her lungs ached from the thin air sweat soaked through her clothes and then cooled in the cold wind, leaving her shivering. But she did not stop. She could not stop. Stopping meant dying, and she was not ready to die. By the 6th hour, she had accumulated a pile of materials. Beside the thermal vent, metal plating and polymer, sheets and support poles, and tools, everything she needed to build something useful. She sat down on a warm rock and allowed herself a brief rest, just a few minutes to catch her breath and let her heart slow down. She drank sparingly from her water supply and ate a small portion of her emergency rations. She needed to conserve her resources. She did not know how long she would be here. She did not know if rescue was coming. She had to assume the worst and plan accordingly. While she rested, she studied the thermal vent more carefully. It was coming from several cracks in the rock, concentrated in one area. If she built her structure over those cracks, the heat would rise up and warm the interior. It would be like having a natural heating system. No fuel required, no maintenance needed, just free warmth from the planet itself. And there was another advantage: the soil around the thermal vent was different from the soil. Elsewhere it was darker and richer, full of minerals deposited by the volcanic activity below. It was volcanic soil, the most fertile soil in the universe. Plants grew fast and strong in volcanic soil. Her mother had taught her that when she was still a child, put a seed in volcanic soil and watch it explode into life. Yuna smiled for the first time since the crash. This thermal vent was not just a source of heat. It was a garden waiting to be planted. She got back to work first. She created a basic frame using the metal poles, 4 corners and 4 walls, and a sloped roof to shed any precipitation. The frame was simple and sturdy, designed to withstand the wind that swept across the basin. Then she covered the frame with the polymer sheets, stretched them tight, and sealed the edges with adhesive tape from her repair kit. The sheets overlapped to prevent gaps. The seals were double-checked to prevent leaks. When she was done, the structure looked like A glowing box sitting on the rocky ground. Sunlight streamed through the transparent walls. Heat rose up from the thermal vent below. The interior was already noticeably warmer than the outside air. She had built a greenhouse. The next step was preparing. The soil she dug into the warm ground, removing rocks and debris until she had exposed the dark volcanic earth beneath it. It was rich soil. She could see that just by looking at it. She could feel it crumbling between her fingers, perfect for growing things. Worked the soil with her tools, breaking up clumps and removing stones and creating neat rows for planting it. It was hard work, but it was familiar work. She had done this 100 times on a dozen different worlds. This was what she knew. This was what she was good at. By the 10th hour, she was ready to plant. She opened the sealed containers from her cargo and examined the seeds inside. Fast-growing vegetables designed for colony worlds, hardy grains that could survive in poor soil, leafy greens that would provide essential nutrients. H variety had been engineered for rapid growth and high yield. The H variety had been tested on dozens of hostile worlds. Each variety had been proven to work. She planted them in neat rows, spacing them carefully, and placing each seed at exactly the right depths. She covered them with soil and patted the earth down firmly. Then she turned her attention to irrigation. The plants would need water to grow. Regular, consistent water in the right amounts. She could not simply pour water on them and hope for the best. She needed a system. She built an irrigation network using tubes and connectors from her supplies. Water would enter at one end, flow through the tubes, and drip slowly onto the soil at regular intervals. But where would the water come from? She did not have enough in her supplies to sustain a garden for more than a few days. She needed a renewable source. She looked at the walls of her greenhouse and noticed that moisture was condensing on the inner surface. Warm air inside was hitting the cooler polymer sheets and releasing its water content. It was the same process that created morning dew on plants. Back on Earth, she could collect that condensation, modified her design, adding collection channels. At the base of the walls, where the condensation would run down and gather, the channels fed into a reservoir which connected to her irrigation system. It was a closed-loop. Water evaporated from the soil, and the plants it condensed on the walls. It was collected and fed back to the roots. Minimal wastes, maximum efficiency. Her father would have been proud, but she still needed a way to filter the water from the pool. She could not rely entirely on condensation. She would need to supplement the system eventually. That was when she remembered the filtration membranes in her cargo. They were designed for colony worlds, where the water sources were often contaminated. They could remove bacteria and parasites and most chemical compounds. She fashioned a filter from the membranes and connected it to a collection system. Water from the pool would pass through the filter and into a storage tank. From there it would feed into the irrigation network. Safe, clean water for her plant, sand, eventually for herself. By the 12th hour she was done. The greenhouse stood complete on the thermal vent inside. The air was warm and moist. The soil was dark and rich. Seeds were planted in neat rows. The irrigation system hummed quietly as water dripped onto the soil, and already impossibly, seeds were beginning to sprout. Tiny green shoots pushed up through the dark earth, reaching for the light that streamed through the transparent walls. Life was taking hold far above in the observation station. Commander Relo stared at the screen in disbelief. She has built an agricultural enclosure, a greenhouse. Temi explained. Humans use them to grow food in hostile environments. They trap heat and light and create a controlled climate for plant growth. I know what a greenhouse is. Rilo snapped. What I do not understand is how she built one in 12 hours. He turned to face Temi, his gray face creased with confusion. Crashed on this world with nothing. Her ship is destroyed. Her supplies are limited. She should be focused on basic survival, finding water, building shelter, staying warm instead. She's farming. Temi considered this for a moment before responding. Perhaps for humans, farming is basic. Survival. Relo frowned, explained. Pulled up data on her console. Humans evolved as persistence hunters and gatherers. They learned to cultivate plants very early in their development. Gator culture is fundamental to their civilization. Do not see it as advanced technology. They see it as a basic survival skill. Every human child learns to plant seeds and 10 gardens. It is passed down from generation to generation. She looked back at the screen, where Yuna was checking on her seedlings for her. This is not unusual. This is simply what humans do." Rillo was silent for a long moment. He watched the human woman move through her greenhouse, checking temperatures and moisture levels and examining the tiny sprouts emerging from the soil. She moved with confidence and purpose. She knew exactly what she was doing. There was no hesitation, no uncertainty, no fear. The plants were already growing faster than he would have thought possible. "Those growth rates," Rillo said slowly, "they are not normal." Temi nodded. "Human agricultural science service seeds have been genetically modified for rapid growth and hostile conditions combined with the geothermal heating in the volcanic soil and the efficient irrigation system." She trailed off, shaking her head. "The plants will be producing food within days." Rello thought about that number. His own species had been practicing agriculture for over 50 million years. They had developed sophisticated systems and advanced technologies. They could grow food on almost any world, but it took time, months or years, to establish a sustainable food source. Decades. To truly terraform a world for agriculture, this human had done it in 12 hours. With nothing but salvaged materials and inherited knowledge, it should not be possible, but it was happening right there. On the screen in front of him, on the surface, Yuna stood back and looked at her work with satisfaction. The greenhouse was complete. The seeds were sprouting. Step 1 of her survival plan was underway. She was exhausted, her body screamed for sleep, but she was not done yet. There was still so much to do. She looked at the brewing equipment still packed in the cargo hold and made a decision. Tomorrow, she would build the brewery. Tonight, she would rest just for a few hours. She needed to conserve her strength. For what lay ahead, she returned to her shelter and wrapped herself in thermal blankets. The night was cold, but not as cold as the night before. Maybe she was just getting used to it. She closed her eyes and let herself drift towards sleep. The sounds of the alien night surrounded her, strange calls and rustles and whispers, but she was not afraid. She knew now that she could survive on this world. She knew that she had the knowledge and the skills to make it work. All she needed was time and determination. The willingness to never give up. Pin the observation station. Rillo filed his first report to the Galactic Council. Subject species: human status, active and healthy, current activities, construction of agricultural infrastructure. Observations: subject demonstrates unexpected levels of competence and adaptability. Will continue monitoring. He looked at the screen one more time before retiring to his quarters. The human was sleeping now. Her breathing was slow and steady. She looked peaceful, almost content. "What are you?" he murmured to himself. What kind of creature builds a farm on the first day of a survival situation? He did not have an answer, but he intended to find one. Whatever it took, however long it required, he would understand this species, and then, perhaps, he would understand why they frightened him so much. Huna woke before dawn with her body stiff and sore, but her mind sharp and focused. She had slept for 5 hours. It was not enough, but it would have to do. There was too much work waiting for her. Many things that needed to be done. She could sleep properly when she was rescued, or when she had built something sustainable enough that she could afford to rest. Whichever came first, she crawled out of her shelter and stretched in the cold darkness, feeling her joints crack and her muscles protest. Stars above were strange and unfamiliar patterns she had never seen before, constellations that had no names in any human language. For a moment, she just stood there looking up at them and thinking about how far from home she was. Thousands of light years, millions of kilometers, a distance so vast that it was almost impossible to comprehend. Yet here she was, standing under an alien, sky-breathing alien, air preparing to build something that would help her survive. Humans were remarkable creatures. Her grandmother had told her that once we are small and weak and we live such short lives, but we never give up, we never stop trying, we never accept that something is impossible. That is our greatest strength. That is what makes us humano. Una smiled at the memory and then got to work. The greenhouse was her first stop. She wanted to check on the plants before she started anything else. The interior was warm and humid. Air smelled of growing things, and the seedlings had grown even more during the night. Some of them were now several centimeters tall. Their leaves were spreading wide, reaching for the light. Their stems were strong and straight, growing exactly as they should. It was working. Her greenhouse was working. She checked the irrigation system, and found it functioning perfectly. Water was condensing on the walls, trickling down into the collection channels, and feeding back into the soil. Reservoir was half full with clean filtered water she could drink from. If she needed to, she took a small sip and found it tasted clean and fresh, a little mineral maybe from the volcanic soil, but safe, definitely safe. That was one less thing to worry about. She ate a few of the emergency rations from her supplies. They were bland and tasteless compressed nutrients designed for survival rather than enjoyment. But they would keep her going until the plants were ready to harvest, a few more days maybe, lest if the growth continued at this rate now, it was time to move on to the next phase of her plan. She walked to the crash site and began unpacking the brewing equipment. It was a good system, modern and efficient, designed for a small restaurant but capable of producing a respectable amount of fermented beverage. Her friend would be upset about the delay in delivery, but Una suspected she would understand once she heard the full story. Brewing equipment consisted of several large metal tanks, a network of tubes and valves, temperature monitors, airlocks, and a collection of specialized tools. Setting it up would take several hours, but the result would be worth the effort. Fermentation was not just about making alcohol. That was what most people thought, but it was only part of the story. Fermentation was one of the oldest technologies in human history. It dated back thousands of years to a time before written language, before metal tools, before cities, before civilization as anyone would recognize it. Ancient humans had discovered that certain processes could transform food and water in useful ways. Rotting fruit could become wine grain, could become beer milk, could become cheese, and along the way something magical happened. The process killed harmful bacteria, preserved nutrients, it created new compounds that had medicinal properties. Fermentation was how humans survived before they had purification systems and refrigeration and modern medicine. It was how they made water safe to drink in places where the rivers were poisoned. It was how they preserved food for long journeys and harsh winters. It was how they treated wounds and cured infections. Shanaina's grandmother had taught her the old ways, traditional methods that had been passed down through generations. Her grandmother had grown up on a farm in the mountains where they still brewed their own alcohol and fermented their own vegetables. She had learned the skills from her mother, who had learned from her mother, going back generations beyond counting. When Una was a child, her grandmother would sit her down in the kitchen and teach her the secrets, how to judge when the fermentation was ready by smell and taste and sound, how to keep the temperature just right, how to prevent contamination, how to create something useful from almost nothing. Those lessons had seemed like quaint, old-fashioned knowledge at the time, something interesting but not really practical in the modern age. Now they might save her life. She spent the next several hours setting up the brewery. The tanks needed to be positioned near the thermal vent to catch some of the heat. Fermentation worked best at specific temperatures, and the geothermal warmth would help maintain consistency. The tubes and valves needed to be connected in the proper sequence to allow for easy monitoring. An adjustment: the airlocks needed to be sealed to prevent contamination while still allowing gases to escape. It was precise work, technical work, the kind of work that required concentration and attention to detail. Una found it almost meditative, connecting pieces and checking seals and adjusting positions until everything was exactly right by hour 16 of her time on the planet. She had a functional brewery standing next to her greenhouse, two structures, now two pieces of infrastructure to steps toward survival, but she still needed raw materials. The plants in her greenhouse were not ready for harvest yet. Leaves were too small, and the fruits had not yet formed. She needed something else to start the first. But she thought about the native plants she had seen during her exploration, the thick purple vegetation that covered the hillsides. Some of those plants might contain sugars or starches that could be fermented. The challenge was figuring out which ones were safe. She spent the next hour walking through the hills collecting samples. She was careful not to take too much from any one area. She did not want to damage the local ecosystem, and she was aware that she was not alone on this world. The creatures she had heard during her first night were out there somewhere, watching, waiting. She did not want to attract their attention by behaving recklessly. She collected samples from a dozen different plant species. Some had thick, fleshy leaves, some had bulbous roots, some had stems filled with sap. Each one was carefully labeled and stored for later analyses. She noticed movement on a ridge above her. She stopped and looked up, shielding her eyes against the pale sun. 3 creatures stood on the rocky outcrop watching her. They were unlike anything she had ever seen before. 6 legs supported a body about the size of a large dog long. Necks held up heads, with large dark eyes and small rounded ears. Their bodies were covered with short gray fur that rippled in the wind. Their mouths were filled with flat teeth clearly designed for eating. Brewery Sozani felt a wave of relief. Herbivores were generally not dangerous unless they felt threatened. These creatures did not look threatened. They looked curious. They watched her with their large dark eyes, tilting their heads as if trying to understand what she was. Suna raised one hand slowly and held it palm up. It was a gesture of peace, a sign that she meant no harm. The creatures tilted their heads even further. One of them made a soft chirping sound. Then they turned and walked away, disappearing over the top of the rig. Yuna let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. First contact, the creatures had not attacked her. They had not fled in terror. They had simply observed and then moved on. It was very interesting. She filed the information away for later consideration and continued collecting samples. Back at her camp, she spread the samples out on a flat rock and began testing them. She did not have laboratory equipment. She could not run chemical analyses or identify specific compounds, but she had other methods, older methods, her grandmother's methods. She crushed each sample and smelled it. Some smelled bitter and acrid. Those she set aside as potentially poisonous. Some smelled neutral with no distinctive odor. Those might be safe but would probably not be useful for fermentation. One sample had a sweet smell, almost like honey. It was a thick-stemmed plant with purple leaves and a bulbous root. The root was where the sweet smell was strongest. Una cut the root open and examined the interior. It was pale and fibrous, with a texture similar to a potato. She touched a tiny amount to her tongue, being careful not to swallow. Sweet, definitely sweet, the kind of sweetness that came from natural sugars. This could work. She processed the roots, chopping them into small pieces and placing them in a mortar to crush. The crushed material released a milky juice that tasted even sweeter than the raw root. She transferred the processed material to one of the fermentation tanks and added water from her filtered supply. Then she opened a sealed container from her equipment and examined the contents. Yeast cultures, several different strains, each designed for specific fermentation conditions. Her friend had invested in high-quality cultures for the restaurant, fast-acting strains that could work in a wide range of temperatures, hardy strains that were resistant to contamination, reliable strains that produced consistent results. Yuna selected the most versatile strain and added it to the tank. Then she sealed the lid and attached the airlock. Now she had to wait. Fermentation took time. The yeast needed to consume the sugars and convert them to alcohol. Process produced carbon dioxide gas, which would bubble through the airlock. If she saw bubbles, it meant the yeast was alive and working. If she did not see bubbles, it meant something had gone wrong. She checked the temperature and adjusted the position of the tank to catch more heat from the thermal vent. Then she stepped back and allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. Greenhouse Brewery. 2 days ago, she had been hurtling through hyperspace on a routine delivery mission. Now she was building a settlement on an alien world. Not bad for a crashed pilot with a cracked rib. Far above in the observation station, Commander Relo was trying to understand what he was seeing. She is making alcohol, he said for the third time. Recreational intoxicants. Why would she waste resources on such a thing? Temi had spent the last several hours researching human fermentation technology. She had consulted databases and historical records and scientific analyses. The answer she had found was fascinating. It is not just recreational, sir. To me, it's brought up a display showing the history of human fermentation. This technology is over 9,000 years old. Humans were fermenting beverages before they had metal tools, before they had written language. It was one of their first technologies. 9,000 years. Srilo shook his head in disbelief. Why would they prioritize such a thing? Because it solves multiple problems at once, Temi explained. Fermentation kills harmful bacteria. It purifies water that would otherwise be dangerous to drink. It preserves food for long periods. It creates compounds with medicinal properties. And yes, it also produces intoxicants. But that is almost a side effect. She pointed at the screen where Yuna was monitoring her fermentation tank for her. This is a water purification system. Food preservation method. A medical tool. Katal and Wanarilo was silent for a long moment. He watched the human woman check the temperature of her tank and adjust its position. She moved with the same confidence and purpose she had shown while building the greenhouse. No hesitation, no uncertainty. Knew exactly what she was doing. How does she know these things? Relo asked. She crashed on an alien world with limited supplies. She had no time to prepare, no time to study. Yet she acts as if she has done this 100 times before, because in a sense, she has. Temi said humans pass knowledge from generation to generation. They teach their children everything they know, and their children teach their children, and so on. Every human alive carries the accumulated wisdom of their ancestors. 1,000 years of learning and experimenting and surviving, all encoded in their culture and their traditions. Relo thought about his own species. They lived such long lives that each individual learned everything through personal experience. There was no need to pass knowledge to the next generation. A generation had time to discover everything on their own, but humans lived fast and died young. They had found a way to cheat their own mortality. They compressed millions of years of learning into each individual lifetime, and that made them dangerous, very dangerous on the surface. Yuna was settling in for another night. She had checked her greenhouse one more time. The plants were growing strong. Some of them would be ready for harvest soon. She had checked her brewery and seen the first bubbles forming in the airlock. The yeast was alive. The fermentation was working. In a few days she would have something drinkable, something safe, something that would prove she could sustain herself on this world. She wrapped herself in her thermal blankets and closed her eyes. 20 hours. She had been on this planet for 20 hours. She had already built 2 functional facilities. She had established a food source and a water purification system. She had made first contact with the local wildlife. Not bad. Not bad at all. But she was not done. Yet tomorrow she would work on the creatures. She had seen the way they watched Hertha, curiosity in their eyes, the lack of fear. They could be useful. It could teach her things about this world that she could not learn on her own, and maybe she could teach them something too. She fell asleep with plans forming in her mind, dreams of creatures that followed her, and plants that grew tall and strong, and a settlement that would outlast her time on this world. In the observation station, Rilo watched her sleep and wondered what she was dreaming about. He could not know, but he suspected it was something ambitious, something that would surprise him again. He was beginning to realize that with humans, surprise was the only thing you could count on. The 24th hour found Yuna awake and planning. She had slept better than she expected. Maybe 5 hours of actual rest. Her body was adapting to the thin atmosphere and the cold temperatures. Her cracked ribs still ached, but the pain was manageable. Now a dull throb rather than a sharp stabbing sensation. She could work with that. She could push through. The greenhouse was thriving when she checked on it. The plants had grown even more overnight. Some of them were now tall enough to brush against the mute polymer walls. The leaves were thick and green and full of life. Few of the fastest growing varieties were showing the first signs of fruit, small round shapes forming at the base of the stems. In another day or two they would be ready to harvest food, real food, not emergency rations. The thought made her mouth water. The brewery was working well. Tooth of fermentation was proceeding exactly as it should. Bubbles rose steadily through the airlock. The liquid inside the tank was cloudy now as the yeast worked its magic. It would not be ready for several more days, but the process was underway, was on track. Everything was going according to plan. Now it was time for the next step. The creature. She had thought about them all night, those 6-legged herbivores. With their curious eyes and their strange chirping calls, they lived on this world. They had evolved here over millions of years. They understood this environment in ways that she never could. They knew which plants were safe to eat. They knew where to find water. They knew how to stay warm during the cold nights. They were a source of information and potentially much more. Yuna had studied the history of human domestication. She knew how her ancestors had tamed wolves and horses and cattle. She knew the techniques they had used, the patience they had shown, the understanding they had developed. It had taken thousands of years in most cases, generations of careful breeding and gradual adaptation, But the basic principles were simple: find out what the animals want, give it to them. Earn their trust, repeat, until they accept you as part of their world. She did not have thousands of years, she did not have generations. She had days, maybe hours, but she also had advantages that her ancestors had not possessed. Had the accumulated knowledge of 10,000 years of domestication, she had nutritious food that no wild creature could resist. She had the understanding that came from studying dozens of alien species. She had patience, incredible patience, kind that her grandmother had taught her during long afternoons in the garden, kind that came from understanding that some things could not be rushed, that some things required time and stillness and trust. She gathered her supplies, a bag full of the nutrient-rich grain from her cargo, some the fresh vegetables from her greenhouse, a container of water, and a small notebook to record her observations. Then she set out toward the hills where she had seen the creatures the day before. The walk took about 20 minutes. The terrain was rocky and uneven. She moved slowly and carefully, conserving her energy and watching for any sign of movement. The sun was still low in the sky, casting long shadows across the ground. The air was cold, but not unbearable. She found the valley without difficulty, was nestled between two hills covered with the purple vegetation the creatures seemed to favor. A small stream ran through the center, providing fresh water, and scattered throughout the valley were the creatures themselves, dozens of them, more than she had expected. They grazed peacefully, eating the purple plants and drinking from the stream. Some of them lay on warm rocks, basking in the morning. Some others groomed each other, picking debris from their gray fur. Looked content, happy, even like they had no concerns in the world. Yuna found a flat rock at the edge of the valley and sat down. She did not approach the creatures. She did not try to attract their attention. She did not do anything that might be perceived as threatening or aggressive. She simply sat there and waited. The creatures noticed her immediately. Every head in the valley turned toward her, large dark eyes fixed on her face. Some of them made nervous chirping sounds. Some of them began moving toward the far end of the valley. They were afraid, or at least cautious, but Yuna did not move. She did not speak. She barely breathed. She just sat there, still as a stone, patient as the rocks around her. After about 30 minutes, the creatures began to relax. They returned to their grazing one by one. They kept watching her, but they no longer seemed alarmed. She was just another feature of the landscape, now a strange new rock that had appeared in their valley. Nothing to worry about, nothing to fear. An hour passed, then another. The sun rose higher, and the temperature increased. Yuna drank water from her container, but she did not eat. She did not want to make any sudden movements. She did not want to startle the creatures. She just sat and watched and learned. She observed their social structure. There was a clear hierarchy. One large creature seemed to be the leader. She was older than the others, with scars on her legs and a calm, confident manner. The other creatures deferred to her. They moved out of her way when she approached. They waited for her to drink before they drank. She was in charge. The younger creatures were more playful. They chased each other through the vegetation and wrestled on the warm rocks. They were curious about everything, including the strange two-legged visitor at the edge of their valley. One of them kept looking at Yuna, young female, by the look of her smaller than the adults with bright, eager eyes. She watched Yuna with obvious fascination, tilting her head this way and that, trying to understand what this strange creature was. Yuna noted all of this in her mental notebook: the leader, the young ones, the hierarchy, behaviors. It was all useful information. It would all help her understand how to approach them. After about 3 hours, one of the young creatures made a move. It was the curious female. She separated from the group and began walking toward Yuna. Her steps were cautious, hesitant. She stopped frequently to look back at the other creatures as if seeking reassurance, but she kept coming closer and closer until she was only about 5 meters away. Yuna slowly reached into her bag and pulled out a handful of the nutrient grain. She placed it on the rock in front of her. Then she pulled her hand back and sat perfectly still. The young creature sniffed the air. Her nose twitched. She could smell the grain, and it smelled good. She took another step forward, then another, then another behind her. The other creatures watched with obvious anxiety. Leader made a warning sound low and rumbling, but the young female ignored it. She was too curious, too hungry, too eager to discover what this strange visitor had brought. She reached the rock where the grain was scattered. She sniffed at it carefully. Then she began to eat. Tuna held her breath. The creature was so close now. She could see the individual hairs on her gray fur. She could hear the soft sounds of chewing. She could feel the warmth radiating from the small body. First contact reel. First contact. The young creature finished the grain and looked up at Unither. Eyes met for a long moment. Neither of them moved. Then the creature made a small sound, a soft chirp that might have been thanks or might have been greeting, or might have been nothing at all, but it felt like communication. It felt like the beginning of something. The creature turned and walked back to her companions. They clustered around her, sniffing at her mouth and making excited sounds. They wanted to know what she had eaten. They wanted to know if it was safe. They wanted to know if there was more. Una smiled and placed another handful of grain on the rock. This time she did not have to wait as long. Within an hour, 3 more creatures had approached. They were still cautious, still nervous, but they came. They attended. They left without showing any signs of fear. By the end of the day, Una had fed almost a dozen of the creatures. The leader still kept her distance. She watched from afar with those calm, intelligent eyes. She was not ready to trust this stranger. Not yet, but the young ones were bolder, came and went freely, now taking the food she offered and returning to their group, learning that she was not a threat, learning that she was a source of good things. It was the first step, the foundation of everything that would come after. Far above in the observation station, Commander Relo had not moved from his post in hours. He watched the human sit perfectly still for what seemed like an eternity. He watched the creatures approach her one by one. He watched her offer food and receive something like acceptance in return. What is happening? Temi had been running analyses and consulting databases. Her conclusions were startling. She is domesticating them. Sir Domesticating Grawl shook his head. It's impossible. Domestication takes thousands of years, generations of selective breeding. She has been interacting with them for a few hours. Temi nodded slowly as Sir, but she is not starting from scratch. She has the knowledge of 10,000 years of human domestication. She knows the techniques. She knows the psychology. Never encountered a predator like her before. They have no instinctive fear of humans. They are naturally curious, naturally slow. Conditions are ideal. Relo watched as another creature approached the human and ate from her offering. It is still remarkable. In my entire career, I have never seen a first contact proceed so smoothly, because humans do not approach other species as equals or as threats. Temi said they approach them as potential partners, potential allies, potential friends. They assume that every species can be won over with the right combination of patience and generosity, and more often than not, they are right. Riolo was silent for a long moment. He thought about all the species that humans had domesticated throughout their short history: dogs and cats and horses and cattle, birds and fish and insects and plants. They had bent the natural world to their will, not through force but through understanding, through patience, through the simple act of offering something and asking for something in return. It was a different kind of conquest, subtle and slow and ultimately irresistible, and now they were doing it here on a world that the Survey Corps had been studying for 15 cycles. A human had been on the surface for 1 day, and she had already begun forming bonds with the native wildlife. If she stayed long enough, if she had time to work, she could change everything on the surface. Una was preparing to return to her camp, though. Sun was beginning to set and the temperature was dropping. She needed to check on her greenhouse and her brewery. She needed to eat a proper meal and get some rest, but she did not want to leave. She felt connected to this place, now connected to these creatures. They were not her friends yet, but they could be, given time, given patience, given the chance to learn that she was not a threat. She stood up slowly. The creatures watched her. The young female who had been first to approach made a small sound, almost like a farewell. "I'll be back tomorrow," Una said softly. "I promise." The creature tilted her head as if she understood. Then she turned and walked back to her companion. Sienna made her way down the hill and back to her camp. Greenhouse was glowing in the fading light. The plants inside were tall and strong, some of them would be ready for harvest tomorrow. The brewery bubbled quietly beside it. The fermentation was progressing. Well, in a few more days she would have something to drink. She ate a meal of emergency rations, supplemented with a few fresh leaves from her greenhouse. They were small and tender and tasted like nothing she had ever experienced before, but they were food real. Food grown on an alien world. It was a small victory, but it felt enormous. She settled into her shelter and thought about the day. 30 hours she had been on this world. For 30 hours, and she had built a greenhouse and a brewery and made first contact with the local wildlife. Not bad for a crashed pilot with nothing but salvage materials and inherited knowledge. Tomorrow, she would go back to the valley. She would bring more food. She would sit and wait and let the creatures come to her, and slowly, day by day, she would earn their trust. She would learn from them, and maybe they would learn from her. Sleep came easily that night. She dreamed of creatures with gray fur and curious eyes. She dreamed of plants growing tall in volcanic soil. She dreamed of a home that she had built with her own hands, and somewhere in the darkness, far above, a commander of an alien species watched her sleep and wondered what she would do next. He was beginning to realize that he could not predict her. Humans were full of surprises, and that perhaps the galaxy was not as well understood as he had believed. The 36th hour began with unexpected visitor. Suna was still asleep in her shelter when she heard sounds outside. Sounds familiar. Sounds familiar. Sounds the padding of many feet on rocky ground. Quiet chirping of creatures communicating with each other. She opened her eyes and listened. They were here. The creatures had come to her. She pushed aside the cover of her shelter very slowly and looked out. In the pale light of early dawn, she could see Thema, a group of about 8 creatures standing around her camp. They were sniffing at the greenhouse with obvious curiosity. They were investigating the brewery with cautious interest. They were exploring every corner of her small settlement as if they owned the place. The young female was among them. She stood closest to the shelter, watching Yuna with those bright, eager eyes. When their gazes met, the creature made a soft, chirping sound, almost like a greeting. "Good morning to you too," Yuna said quietly. The creature tilted her head at the sound of Yuna's voice. She did not flinch. She did not seem frightened at all. She just watched with that endless alien curiosity. Tuna sat up slowly and reached for her bag of grain. The movement caught the attention of every creature in the camp. His perked up noses, twitched eyes fixed on her hands. They remembered the food from yesterday. They had come looking for more. Yuna scattered some grain on the ground in front of her shelter. The young female approached immediately and began eating. The others followed one by one until all 8 of them were clustered around Yuna, enjoying the unexpected breakfast. She watched them eat with a sense of wonder and accomplishment. These creatures had walked down from the hills in the middle of the night. They had sought her out. They had remembered that she was a source of food, and they had trusted her enough to come to her camp. It was remarkable progress, far faster than she had expected, but she could not afford to rush things. Trust was fragile. Wrong move could shatter everything she had built. So she sat perfectly still and let the creatures eat. She did not try to touch them. She did not make any sudden movements. She just watched and waited and let them set the pace. When the grain was gone, the creatures began exploring the camp in more detail. They sniffed at her tools and her supplies. They investigated the polymer walls of the greenhouse. They circled the fermentation tanks with obvious confusion. The young female was particularly interested in the greenhouse. She pressed her nose against the transparent wall and stared at the plants growing inside. The warmth and the moisture and the strange green shapes seemed to fascinate her. Yuna stood up slowly and walked to the greenhouse door. The creatures scattered briefly, but they did not flee. They just moved back a few meters and watched to see what she would do. She opened the door and stepped inside. The warm, moist air enveloped her like a hug. The plants rustled softly in the gentle circulation of the ventilation system. She picked a handful of leaves from one of the larger plants and walked back outside. The creatures watched with intense interest. Tuna sat down on a warm rock near the thermal vent. She ate one of the leaves slowly and deliberately, showing the creatures that it was safe, showing them that this was food. Then She placed a few leaves on the ground in front of Hertha. Young female approached first as she always did. She sniffed at the leaves and made a curious sound. Then she took a small bite. She chewed slowly, her large dark eyes widened with what might have been pleasure. The leaves were good, better than the wild vegetation she was used to, sweeter and more tender and full of moisture. She ate the rest of them quickly and looked at Yuna for more. The other creatures crowded closer, wanting their share. Yuna laughed and went back to the greenhouse for more leaves. She spent the next hour feeding the creatures and observing their behavior. They were becoming more comfortable with her presence. Some of them allowed her to come within arm's reach without flinching. A few of them even brushed against her legs as they moved. Boundaries, learning that she was safe by mid-morning. Yuna was ready to try something new. She reached out her hand slowly toward the young female. Creature froze, her eyes fixed on the approaching hand. Every muscle in her body tensed, but she did not. Renuna held her hand still just a few centimeters from the creature's head. She could feel the warmth radiating from the small body. She could see the rapid pulse beating in the creature's neck. She could sense the fear and curiosity battling inside. "That alien mind eye will not hurt you," she said softly. "I promise." The creature's ears twitched at the sound of her voice, and then something wonderful happened. She leaned forward and pressed her head against Yuna's palm. The touch was gentle, almost tentative. If the creature was not quite sure what she was doing, but it was contact, real physical contact, a bridge between two species. Yuna held her breath and stayed perfectly still. She could feel the creature's pulse slowing as the initial fear faded. She could feel the muscles relaxing as trust began to take hold. She could feel the warmth and the softness and the life beneath her fingers. For a long moment they stayed like that, human and alien, connected by nothing more than patience and kindness. Then the creature pulled away and returned to her companions. But something had changed. The barrier was broken. From now on, things would move faster. Far above in the observation station, Commander Rilo had summoned his senior officers for an emergency meeting. He had not slept in over a day, and his eyes were red with exhaustion, but he could not rest, not now. When history was unfolding on the screens in front of him, officers, he said, "What we are witnessing is unprecedented. A single human has been on the surface of Velisfor for 36 hours. It's that time she has constructed agricultural infrastructure and fermentation technology. Has made contact with the native wildlife fand. As of this morning, she has initiated physical contact with one of them." He paused to let the words sink in. "Our species has been observing this world for 15 cycles. We have studied those creatures from a distance for hundreds of years. We have never been able to approach them. They flee from our drones and our probes and our remote sensors, and yet this human sat in their valley for a few hours, and they came to her willingly." One of the officers raised a hand. "Sir, could she be using some kind of chemical attractant, perfs? A pheromone or a scent that triggers a submissive response?" Arilo shook his head. "We have analyzed everything she has used. Grain is standard human agricultural product. The vegetables are from her greenhouse there. There's nothing chemically special about any of it. Then how is she doing it?" Another officer. Ascadrillo turned to Temi, who had been compiling data throughout the night. Temi stood and activated a display showing human domestication. History: humans have been domesticating animals for approximately 15,000 years. In that time, they have formed symbiotic relationships with dozens of species: dogs, cats, horses, cattle, pigs, sheep, goats, chickens. The list goes on. She changed the display to show the techniques humans use. The process is always the same. First, they identify what the animal wants, usually food or protection or shelter. Then they provide it consistently and reliably. They associate themselves with positive experiences. They become a source of good things in the animal's world. Over time, the animal learns to trust them. Over generations, the animal becomes dependent on them, and eventually the animal's entire existence becomes intertwined with human civilization. She looked around at the assembled officers. This human is following the same pattern. She has identified what those creatures want. She is providing it. She is associating herself with positive experiences, and the creatures are responding exactly as thousands of other species have responded throughout human history. But at timescale, one officer protested, "Domestication takes thousands of years. She has been working with them for less than a day." Temi noted, "Yes, the speed is remarkable, But consider the circumstances. These creatures have never encountered a predator like her. They have no instinctive fear to overcome, and she has knowledge that her ancestors did not have 10,000 years of accumulated wisdom about how to approach and befriend other species. She knows exactly what to do and when to do it. She is not reinventing the process. She is applying techniques that have been refined over hundreds of generations. Rilo stood and walked to the main viewing screen. The human was sitting in the middle of a group of creatures now. Some of them were eating from her hands. Others were lying near her, obviously relaxed and comfortable. The young female who had been first to approach was pressed against her side like a devoted pet. She is building a community, he said, quietly, not just a shelter or a food source, a community of living things that depend on her and trust. Hertha officers were silent. They understood the implications. If the human stayed on this world long enough, she would reshape its shit, would create an ecosystem centered around herself. She would turn this wild alien planet into something familiar, something human, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop Heron. The surface Yuna was naming her new companions. She could not help it. It was a human thing to do. The young female became Bomi, which meant spring in the language of her grandmother, because she was new and fresh and full of possibility. The large leader who still kept her distance became Hannah, which meant flower, because despite her size and strength, there was something delicate about her, something beautiful. The others got names too. There was Duri, who was brave and always the second to try new things. There was Miru, who watched everything with thoughtful, contemplative eyes. There was Sora, whose fur had a bluish tint that reminded Yuna of the sky. There was Nabi, who moved gracefully like a butterfly dancing on the wind. There was Tai Yang, who sought out the warmest spots and basked in the sun, and there was Buell, whose eyes seemed to hold the light of stars. 8 creatures, 8 names, 8 new members of her growing family by afternoon. They were following her everywhere. When she walked to the greenhouse, they came along. When she checked on the brewery, they clustered around her. When she sat down to rest, they arranged themselves nearby. They were not just tolerating her presence anymore. They were seeking it out, wanting to be near her, choosing her company over the empty valley where they had spent their lives. Yuna built them an enclosure near the greenhouse. It was simple, just a ring of rocks and salvaged metal to mark out a space. She added some bedding made from dried vegetation. She positioned it near the thermal vent so it would stay warm during the cold nights. The creatures investigated the enclosure with curiosity. Hannah, the leader, finally approached and sniffed at every corner. She stood in the center and looked around with those calm, intelligent eyes. Then she lay down and closed her eyes. The other creatures followed her lead. One by one, they settled into the enclosure and made themselves comfortable. I watched them with tears in her eyes. She was not sure why she was crying. Maybe it was exhaustion, maybe it was relief, maybe it was the overwhelming emotion of seeing her plan come together. These creatures trusted her. Now they had accepted her as part of their world. They had chosen to stay with her instead of returning to their valley. It was more than she had dared to hope for. It was everything she needed. Night fell over Velis, for the temperature dropped toward freezing. The wind howled across the rocky basin, but inside the enclosure the creatures were warm and safe. And beside them, sitting on a heated rock near the thermal vent, Yuna kept watch. She was tired, so very tired, but she did not want to leave them. Not tonight. She wanted to be close to her new family. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Rescue might arrive or it might not. She did not know what the future held, but right now, in this moment, she had everything she needed: food growing in her greenhouse, water purifying in her brewery, companions who trusted her and depended on her home that she had built with her own hands. She closed her eyes and let the warmth of the thermal vent soak into her bones. 40 hours. She had been on this world for 40 hours, and she had accomplished more than she ever thought possible. Whatever happened next, she would be ready for it. She was certain of that. Now in the observation station, Rilo watched the humans sleep among the creatures she had befriended. He felt something he could not name, not fear exactly, not admiration, something in between. She is remarkable, he said, to no one in particular. Temi, who was still at her station, looked up. Yes, sir. She Isrilo shook his head slowly. In 40 hours she has done what we could not do in 15 cycles. She has made this world her own. He turned away from the screen and The most terrifying thing is that she does not seem to think it is unusual for her. This is simply what humans do to me, not it. That is the nature of their species, sir. They do not just survive, they transform, they build, they create, they make every world they touch a little more human, and in time this world will be no different. Rilo said nothing, but he knew she was right. The humans were coming, and nothing in the galaxy could stop them. The 42nd hour found Commander Rilo standing before the Galactic Council's emergency transmission relay. He had spent the last several hours compiling his observations into a preliminary report. What he had witnessed demanded immediate attention. The Council needed to know. The entire galaxy needed to know this. Is Commander Rilo of Survey Station Velis 4. He began. I am transmitting an urgent observation. Report regarding human activity on the surface below. Paused and gathered his thoughts. 42 hours ago, a human cargo vessel crashed in the northern basin of our observation world 1. Survivor was recovered from the wreckage. A female of approximately 34 standard years. She was injured and stranded with limited supplies and no means of communication. Standard survival protocols predict death within 72 to 96 hours under these conditions. He looked at the data scrolling across his screen. That prediction was wrong. Over the past 42 hours, the subject has demonstrated capabilities that far exceed our previous assessments of human potentials, has constructed a fully functional agricultural facility using salvaged materials and geothermal energy, has established a fermentation system for water purification and food preservation, has made contact with the native wildlife, and initiated what appears to be a domestication process. She has done all of this while injured and operating in a hostile environment with inadequate resource. Rilo felt the weight of what he was about to say. I am forced to conclude that our current threat assessment of humanity is fundamentally flawed. This species does not merely survive in hostile environments, they transform them. They reshape worlds to suit their needs with a speed and efficiency that defies explanation. I am recommending an immediate upgrade of human classification from emerging to priority observation. Ended the transmission and sat back in his chair. Council would receive his report within a few hours. They would analyze it and debate it and eventually make some kind of decision, but Rilo already knew that it would not matter. Decided the humans would keep doing what they did, building, spreading, transforming everything they touched. It was their nature, could not be stopped on. The surface below, Yuna was beginning her morning routines, had slept among the creatures all night, had been cold and uncomfortable but also strangely peaceful, waking up surrounded by warm bodies and soft breathing, had felt like coming home. Creatures stirred as she stood up. Bomi, the young female, was first to her feet, pressing against Yuna's leg and making soft chirping sounds. "Good morning," Yuna said, scratching behind the creatures. "Ears, are you hungry?" The other creatures woke and gathered around her. They had learned the routine. No morning meant food. Food meant the strange two-legged creature who had become part of their world. Yuna walked to the greenhouse with her companions trailing behind her. She opened the door and stepped inside. The warm, moist air enveloped her. The plants were magnificent, gnarled and strong and heavy with fruit. She harvested a basket full of vegetables and carried them outside. The creatures clustered around as she distributed the food, ate greedily. These cultivated plants were better than anything they had found in the wild, sweeter and more nutritious and easier to digest. They were becoming dependent on her, and she was becoming attached to them. It was a dangerous thing in some ways. Rescue came, she would have to leave them behind, but she tried not to think about that. She tried to focus on the present. The simple joy of feeding creatures who trusted Heron, the satisfaction of seeing her greenhouse produce real food on. The knowledge that she had built something meaningful on this alien world. After breakfast, she checked on the brewery. The fermentation was nearly complete. The liquid in the tank had cleared and the bubbling had slowed to almost nothing. She drained a sample and examined it carefully. Color was pale amber. The smell was sharp and slightly sweet. The taste, she took a small sip and made a face. It was not good, not by any reasonable standard. Too bitter and too strong, and not at all pleasant, but it was safe. Alcohol content was high enough to kill any harmful bacteria. The fermentation had done its job. She sealed the batch and set it aside for storage later. She would use it to purify water from the pool later. She would use it to disinfect wounds and clean equipment later. She might even drink some of it if she got desperate enough. But for now, it was simply proof that she could sustain herself on this world, proof that her grandmother's teachings still held value across the stars, proof that 10,000 years of human knowledge could not be erased by a crash landing on an alien planet. She started a second batch of fermentation, using more of the native roots she had collected. This one might turn out better. She was learning the properties of the local plant. She was adapting her techniques to work with the available materials. Each batch would be an improvement. On the last, that was how progress works. Small steps, building on small steps. Until something remarkable emerged. The creatures followed her as she worked. They had no idea what she was doing, but they seemed content to watch. Bomi in particular stayed. Cloche had become something like a pet now, always at Yuna's side, always watching with those bright, curious eyes, always ready to investigate whatever new thing Yuna was working on. Yuna found herself talking to the creature as she worked, explaining what she was doing and why the creature could not understand the words, but she seemed to appreciate the attention. She chirped and tilted her head and occasionally nudged Yuna's hand as if offering encouragement. It was companionship, simple and pure, kind that transcended species and language. Around midday, Yuna decided to explore further. She wanted to understand more about this world. She wanted to find other resources, other opportunities. The creatures followed her as she walked into the hills. They moved in a loose group with Hannah, the leader, at the front, and Bomi at Yuna's side. Felt like an expedition, a proper exploration party, complete. With local guides who knew the terrain, they found a second water source about a kilometer from the campa. Larger pool fed by underground springs. The water was clear and cold and seemed even purer than the first pool. Yuna collected samples and marked the location on her mental map. Another resource, another step toward security. Further on, they found a cave. It was not large, but it was dry and sheltered from the wind. Hannah led the group inside, and they all sniffed at the walls and the floor. This was a place they knew, a place they had used before. Shelter for cold nights and bad weather. Yuna examined the cave with interest. It could be useful. Secondary shelter if something happened to her campus. Storage location for supplies. A refuge in an emergency. She made note of its location and continued exploring. By late afternoon, they had covered several kilometers. Saya had mapped water sources and vegetation patterns and potential shelter sites. She had learned where the creatures preferred to graze and where they avoided. She had begun to understand the rhythms of this world, the way life flowed across the landscape. It was knowledge that could not be found in any database, knowledge that came only from walking the ground and breathing the air and living in a place. The creatures were teaching her even when they did not know they were teaching. Their behavior revealed secrets about the environment. Their choices showed what was safe and what was dangerous. Their instincts guided her toward resources she might never have found on her own. This is why humans domesticated animals, Yuna thought to herself, not just for food or labor or companionship, but for wisdom. Every domesticated species carries knowledge of its environment. By befriending them, we gain access to that knowledge. It was a partnership, a symbiosis, each species offering something the other needed. Humans provided food and protection. Animals provided guidance and understanding. Together, they could survive anywhere. Far above in the observation station, Commander Rilo was reviewing the footage of the expedition. He had watched the human lead a group of wild creatures across the landscape. He had seen them follow her willingly, had observed the way they communicated through gesture and sound, and he had reached a disturbing conclusion. Is not just domesticating them, he said, she is integrating with them. Temi not a dia, sir. She is becoming part of their social structure. They are beginning to treat her as one of their own. How is that possible? They are different species. Their basic biology is completely different. She cannot communicate with them in any meaningful way, but she can. Temi said, not with words, but with actions and gestures and consistent behavior. She has learned their body language. She has adapted to their social cues. She is speaking a language that transcends words. Rilo Shh. Watched the screen where Yuna was walking among the creatures. They moved around her naturally like water flowing around a stone. She had become part of the pattern, a fixed point in their world. It should have taken years, he said, generations of breeding and selection. How can she accomplish this in ours? Because she is not trying to change them, Temmie said. She is changing herself. She is adapting to fit into their world instead of forcing them to fit into hers. Is a different approach, a more efficient approach, and it works. Rilo was silent for a long moment. Thought about all the species the Survey Corps had studied over the centuries, all the attempts they had made to understand alien life, all the probes and drones and remote sensors they had always observed from a distance, always kept themselves separate from the species they studied. They had never considered becoming part of the community they were observing, but this human had done exactly that. She had immersed herself in the lives of these creatures. She had earned their trust by being present and consistent and condemned. Now they treated her as one of their own. It was a fundamentally different approach to interacting with other species, and it seemed to work far better than anything the Survey Corps had ever tried. What are the implications? Rilo asked. If humans can integrate with alien species this quickly, what does that mean for the rest of the galaxy? Consider the question carefully. It means that anywhere humans go, they will form relationships with the native life. They will domesticate and adapt and integrate. They will make allies of species that should be strangers, and they will do it faster than anyone expects. She looked at the screen where Yuna was now heading back toward her camp. Creatures were following her like a loyal garden. Time. There will be no world that is truly alien to them. Every planet will become part of their network. Every species will become a potential partner. They will spread, not just through colonization, but through connection. Rilo nodded slowly. That's what I feared. Temmie looked at him curiously. Feared Cirilo. Turned to face Herbie. 'Cause if they can do that, if they can form bonds with any species anywhere, then they cannot be stopped. They cannot be contained. They cannot be controlled. They will keep spreading and connecting and integrating until the entire galaxy as part of their web. Temmie was silent. She understood what he meant. The humans were not conquering the galaxy through force. They were conquering it through friendship, and that was far more dangerous because no one knew how to fight against kindness. No one knew how to resist trust. No one knew how to remain separate from a species that wanted to embrace the entire universe. On the surface, Yuna was settling in for the night. She sat near the thermal vent with her creatures gathered around her. The stars were coming out strange, unfamiliar patterns in an alien sky, but she no longer felt alone. She had her greenhouse and her brewery. She had her enclosure and her water sources. She had Bomi pressed against her side and Hannah watching calmly from her spot. Nearby, she had built a life here, a real life, and whatever happened next, she would be ready. 44 hours, she said to herself. 44 hours, and look what we have. Doni Bomi chirped softly as if an Agramentuna smiled and closed her eyes. Tomorrow, rescue might come, more, it might not. Either way, she would be all right. She had proven that. She had proven it to herself and to the creatures who trusted her and to the unseen watchers in the sky. Above, humans did not just survive, they thrived on everywhere, always. 48th hour arrived with the sound of engines, and the schooner had been harvesting vegetables when she first heard Ida. Deep rumbling that grew louder and louder until it filled the entire valley. She dropped her basket and ran to an open area where she could see above the hills. The creatures scattered in panic. They had never heard anything like this before. The sound was too loud and too strange and too overwhelming. Even Hannah, who had been calm through everything, fled toward the enclosure only. Bomi stayed with Yuna pressed against her leg and trembling with fear. It is okay, Yuna said softly, placing her hand on the creature's head. It is okay. They are friends. Bomi did not look convinced, but she stayed. A ship was descending through the purple clouds. It was human. Yuna could tell by the design's leak silver with the angular efficiency that characterized human engineering. It's a rescue shuttle, standard issue for the Colonial Rescue Service. Someone had received her distress signal after all. Someone had come. The ship landed about 100 meters from her camp. the engines powered down with a whine that faded into silence for a moment. Nothing happened, then the side hatch opened with a hiss of pressurized air. A man stepped out. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with short black hair and the kind of weathered face that came from years of space travel. He wore the uniform of the Colonial Rescue Service, dark blue, with silver trim, and the insignia of his division on his shoulder. He carried a medical kit in one hand and a survival pack in the other. He stopped dead when he saw what was in front of him. A greenhouse stood glowing with green plants. A fermentation system hummed beside its strange six-legged creatures huddled in a makeshift enclosure. More creatures were scattered across the landscape, some watching from the hills, some hiding in the vegetation. In the center of it all stood a woman, dirty and tired but grinning from ear to ear. "You must be the rescue," Una said. The man blinked open his mouth, closed it again, then finally managed to speak. "I am Doan," he said, slowly. "Pilot Doan of the Colonial Rescue Service. I was sent to retrieve a crash survivor." He looked around again as if he could not believe his eyes. "But you do not look like someone who needs rescuing." Juna laughed. It was the first real laugh she had allowed herself in to descend. It felt wonderful. Bubbled up from somewhere deep inside Hera, release of all the tension and fear and determination that had kept her going. "I had some time to kill," she said. When she could speak again, thought, "I would make myself useful." Toward her, his boots crunched on the rocky ground, his medical kit swung forgotten at his side. He was staring at the greenhouse with an expression of complete bewilderment. "That a greenhouse? Yes. Did you build it?" "Yesin, to days less than that, actually closer to 1.5. Dohan stopped in front of her and shook his head. "I've been doing rescue operations for 15 years. I have seen survivors in all kinds of conditions, injured and starving and half dead from exposure. I have pulled people from wrecked ships and crashed habitats and failed colonies." He looked around at the camp again. "I have never seen anything like this." Una shrugged. "I got lucky. The crash left most of my cargo intact. The planet turned out to be more hospitable than it looks." Lucky Dune looked at the greenhouse full of thriving plants, at the brewery bubbling quietly beside it, the creatures watching from the enclosure, at Bomi still pressed against Una's leg. "This is not luck," he said. "This is something else entirely." He knelt down and examined Bomi with professional curiosity. The creature tensed at his approach, but did not flinch, trusted Una. Una was not afraid. "So Bomi states this one of the native species?" "Yes, and it is not trying to eat you." "The herbivores very gentle, very curious. They have been helping me explore the area." "Helping?" "Yes, they know this world much better than I do. Showed me water sources and shelter sites. They warned me about dangerous terrain. They have been invaluable." Don stood up slowly. His face showed the struggle of a man trying to process something that did not fit into his understanding of the universe. "You befriended alien wildlife in to dice it was not that hard." Una said. "You just have to be patient and bring food, lots of food." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a handful of grain. Bomi immediately perked up. Una scattered the grain on the ground and the creature began eating. Hapolitahan watched with wide eyes. "That is remarkable." "That is." He trailed off, shaking his head. "I do not have words for what that is." Una smiled. "Let me give you the torche." Led him around the camp, showing him everything she had built, the greenhouse with its rows of thriving plants and its self-sustaining irrigation system, the brewery with its fermentation tanks and filtration equipment, enclosure where the creatures rested and slept, the storage areas where she had organized her supplies, the water collection points and the thermal vents and the carefully mapped terrain. Hun listened and nodded and occasionally asked questions, but mostly he just looked, taking it all and trying to understand how one person could accomplish so much in so little time. Finally he sat down on a rock and rubbed his face with his hands. "The colony is not going to believe this," he said. "What do you mean? They sent me to rescue a crash survivor. They were expecting me to bring back someone traumatized and injured, someone who needed medical attention and psychological support, someone who had barely survived a terrible ordeal. Instead, I am going to bring back," he gestured at the camp, "say, fully functional settlement with agriculture and infrastructure and domesticated animals." Suna sat down beside him. "I was just doing what I was taught. What you were taught. My parents raised me on a colony world. My mother taught me farming, my father taught me engineering, my grandmother taught me fermentation, everything I did. Her eye learned from them. Doan looked at her with something like awe. Then, they must have been remarkable people. They were ordinary people, Yuna said, doing ordinary things, teaching their daughter the skills she would need to survive. That is what humans Tao pass knowledge from one generation to the next. Build on what came. Before we learn from our ancestors and we teach our descendants, somehow all of that knowledge ends up in one person, in the right place at the right time. She looked around at her campy AM, not special I. Just had good teachers and I paid attention. Doan was silent for a long moment, then he laughed. It was a sudden, unexpected sound, but it was genuine. You are remarkable, he said. Whether you think so or not, you crashed on an alien world with nothing, and in 48 hours you built a home. He stood up and brushed off his uniform. We should get you back to the ship. The colony is waiting, yes, Yuna said. But first I need to do something. What? She walked to the enclosure where the creatures were waiting. They had calmed down since the ship landed. Hannah was watching from her usual spot. The others were scattered around, looking curious and slightly nervous. Yuna knelt down, and Bomi immediately came to her. The young creature pressed against her, making soft chirping sounds. Have to go now, Yuna said. My people are here. They need me somewhere else. Bomi made a sad sound, something that might have been understanding or might have been protest. I will come back, Yuna said. I promise I will not forget you. She scratched behind Bomi's ears one last time, then she stood and walked to the others. She said goodbye to each of them, Hannah and Duri and Miru and Sora and Nabi and Taiyang and Bulj. Touched their heads and spoke their names and thanked them for their trust. They did not understand her words, but they understood her tone. They understood that something was ending. When she was done, she walked back to Dohunkin. We take some samples. What kind of samples? Seeds from my greenhouse's cultures, from my brewery, some recordings of these creatures, data on the environment. And the Terendahun, not a die, do not see why not. It is all yours. You've built it. Tuna spent the next 30 minutes gathering everything she wanted to bring. She packed seeds in sealed containers. She collected yeast cultures in sterile vials. She downloaded all her observations onto data drives. She even harvested a last batch of vegetables for the journey. Creatures watched her work with sad, confused eyes. They knew something was changing. They did not understand what, but they could feel it when everything was packed. Yuna returned to the enclosure one last time. She hugged Bomi and whispered in her ear, "Be good, take care of the others. I'll be back someday then." She stood and walked to the rescue shuttle without looking back. She looked back, she might not be able to leave. Dahan sealed the hatch behind them. The engines powered up with a familiar roar. The shuttle lifted off and rose through the purple sky below. The creatures watched it go. They made sad chirping sounds as it disappeared into the clouds, and then it was gone. Yana was gone. The camp remained, the grahos and the brewery and the enclosure.
8.
Plants growing and the fermentation bubbling and the warm rocks by the thermal vent. It would all continue without her. The creatures would return too. Their routines. The plants would keep growing until they outgrew their containers. The brewery would run dry and fall silent. Eventually everything she had built would decay and return to the earth, but the memory would remain in the minds of the creatures who had trusted herein. The data she was carrying back to her people and the knowledge that would be shared and preserved and passed on. Nothing was ever really lost. That was another thing her grandmother had taught her. Knowledge persists even when the nowhere is going to end. The observation station commander Relo watched the shuttle ascend. He felt a strange mixture of emotions: relief that the human was finally leaving, regret that he would not see what she might have done next, something else, something he could not quite name. "She is gone," Temi said quietly. "Yes," Rilo replied. "She is gone, but she took sample seeds and cultures in data. She is going to spread what she learned here, spread it where to the colony, and from there to other colonies, and from there to the rest of the galaxy." Rilo nodded slowly. "Of course, that is what they do. They share knowledge. They build on each other's discoveries. They never let anything go to waste." He turned away from the screen. In a few years, every human colony will know how to survive on a world like this, and, in a few decades, Temmie finished the thought, they will be back. Yes. Rilo said they will be back in next time. There will be more of them next time. They will stay next time. They will build something permanent in this world. Will never be the same again. Temmie looked at the screen where the shuttle was. Now just a distant speck. Is that a bad thing? Cirilo considered the question. Carefully, I do not know, he admitted. Perhaps change is not inherently bad. Perhaps it is simply inevitable. He walked back to his command chair and sat down heavily. I know is that we are witnessing the beginning of something, a transformation that will reshape this world and many others, and we cannot stop it. We can only watch and try to understand it. The shuttle climbing toward orbit, Yuna pressed her face against the window. She watched the planet shrink below her, the rocky basin where she had crashed. The hills where the creatures live, the thermal vents where she had built her greenhouse, it all looked so small from up here, so fragile. She closed her eyes and made a silent promise. I will come back. I'll bring others. We will build something real, something that lasts. Shuttle broke through the atmosphere and entered the blackness of space. The stars welcomed her back, strange and familiar at the same time. She was going home, but part of her heart would always remain on that distant world with the creatures who had trusted her and the life she had built in 48 hours. The rescue shuttle docked with the colony transport ship 3 hours after leaving Velis for Yuna, was greeted by a medical team who insisted on giving her a full examination, checked her vitals and scanned her injuries and ran tests for exotic pathogens. They found nothing seriously wrong, just fatigue and dehydration and minor injuries from the crash. Cracked rib was healing well on its own. The cut on her forehead had closed without infection. She was in remarkably good condition for someone who had survived a crash landing on an alien world. The medical officer shook her head in disbelief as she reviewed the results. You should be in much worse shape, she said. 2 days on a Category 3 world with limited supplies. Most survivors come back traumatized and malnourished. You look like you just returned from a camping trip. Yuna smiled. It was not so. Body had good equipment and good weather. Officer gave her a skeptical look. The rescue pilot told me about your camp, the greenhouse, and the brewery, and the animals. That is not what most people do when they crash on an alien planet. Tuna shrugged. I got bored waiting though. Officer laughed and signed off on her medical clearance. You are free to move around the ship. We will reach the colony in about 3 days. Some rest you have earned. Tuna thanked her and left the medical bay, but rest was not what she wanted. She found a quiet corner of the common area and began reviewing the data she had collected, all notes and observations and recordings, everything she had learned about Velis 4 and its creatures. There was so much potential there, so many possibilities. The greenhouse she had built would continue functioning for a while. The irrigation system was self-sustaining. Plants would keep growing until they outgrew their containers or the seasons changed. Eventually, it would all break down, but the foundation was there if someone returned with proper supplies and equipment. If someone built on what she had started, they could establish a permanent settlement, real colony, a new home for humanity and the creatures. They would remember her. They would remember the food she had given them, the trust she had earned, the connection they had formed. When humans returned, they would find creatures already prepared to accept them, already willing to work with them, already halfway to domestication. She had planted seeds not just in the volcanic soil, but in the minds of living beings. And those seeds would grow whether she was there to see it or not. Doan found her staring at her data and sat down across from her. You should be sleeping, he said. I cannot sleep, too much to think about. He nodded, understanding that was quite an experience. You head down there. It was. Yuna agreed, but it was more than just survival. I learned something important. What? She looked up at him with bright, determined eyes. That we can make a home anywhere if we are patient and willing to work. I always knew it theoretically. Now I know it in my bones. Dohan studied her face. He saw something there that he recognized. A fire that would not be extinguished. Hey, drive that could not be stopped. You want to go back, he said. It was not a question. Iswite is a dangerous world, far from any supporters, away from becoming a proper colony. No, Yuna said, but that is exactly why. She leaned forward. There are millions of worlds out there. Most of them are like Velis 4. Hostile and difficult, and far from anything familiar, if we only settle. The easy worlds we will never spread very far, but if we learn to thrive on the hard worlds, she spread her hands then. Nothing can stop you. Don was quiet for a moment. He thought about all the crash survivors he had rescued over the years. Most of them wanted nothing more than to return to civilization, to forget their ordeal, and never speak of it again. This woman wanted to go back. She wanted to take what she had learned and build something permanent. She wanted to transform a hostile alien world into a new home for humanity. Was either inspiring or insane. He could not decide which. The colony officials will want to interview you, he said. Finally, they want to understand how you accomplished what you did. No, Unisadond, I will tell them everything, every technique, and every observation, and every mistake. Will give them all my data and all my samples, and then I will ask them for a ship A, small one, enough to transport a team, and supplies enough to return to Velis for and continue what I started. You think they will agree? I think they will have to. She smiled. Once I show them what one person can do in 48 hours, they will want to see what a dozen people can do in a year. And laughed. He could not help it too. Are either the bravest person I have ever met, he said, or the craziest, maybe both. Yuna admitted, but I know what I want. Tand, I know I can do it, so I might as well try. The transport ship arrived at the colony 3 days later. Yuna was met at the docking bay by a crowd of officials and scientists, and curious onlookers. Word had spread about the crashed pilot had built a settlement in 2 days. Everyone wanted to hear her story. Everyone wanted to understand how she had done it. She spent the next week in meetings and interviews and presentations. She showed them the data she had collected, the readings from the thermal vents and the water sources, the analysis of the volcanic soil and the native vegetation, the recordings of the creatures and their behavior. She showed them the seeds she had brought back, hardy vegetables designed for hostile worlds, native plants that could be cultivated with the right technique. She showed them the yeast cultures from her brewery, strains that could purify water and preserve food under almost any conditions. She explained her methods and her reasoning and her mistakes. She answered every question with patience and detail. When she was done, she made her request. Want to go back? The officials looked at each other. They had expected this, but hearing it spoken aloud was still surprising. You understand the risks, one of them said. Yes, you understand that we cannot guarantee your safety. Yes, you understand that if something goes wrong, we may not be able to rescue you again. Yuna nodded. I understand all of that, but I also understand something else. That world is waiting for us. It has resources and potential, and life it could become a home for hundreds of people, maybe thousands. All it needs is someone willing to do the work. She looked around at the assembled officials. I am willing. Give me a ship and a team, and I will prove it. The debate lasted for weeks. There were arguments and counter-arguments about cost and safety and priorities. Some officials wanted to focus on established colonies. Others saw the potential in new expansion. The end, it was the data that decided things. Evidence was too compelling to ignore. One person had built a functioning settlement in less than 2 days. Imagine what a prepared team could accomplish. Imagine the possibilities. They gave her a ship, a small exploration vessel with room for 12 crew members. They gave her supplies, agricultural equipment and construction materials and scientific instruments. They gave her volunteers and engineers and farmers who wanted to be part of something new. And 6 months after her crash landing, Yuna returned to Velis for. The planet looked the same from orbit, brown and green and beautiful in its harsh way, but as the ship descended toward the northern basin, Yuna saw something that made her heart race. Greenhouse was still there, overgrown and damaged, but still standing. Plants had burst through the polymer walls. They had spread across the thermal vent. They had seeded the surrounding soil. Life was taking hold, and in the valley beyond, the creatures were watching. They remembered. They had been waiting. Yuna was first out of the ship when it landed. She walked toward the greenhouse with tears streaming down her face. Behind her, the crew watched in amazement as the creatures emerged from the hills. Dozens of them, 6-legged herbivores with gray fur and curious eyes. They approached cautiously at first, but then one of them broke from the group and ran toward. Yunaid was Bomi, older, now larger, but still recognizable. still the same bright-eyed creature who had been first to trust Hershey. Pressed against Yuna's legs and made soft, chirping sounds, almost like crying, almost like, "Welcome, I told you," Yuna whispered. "I told you I would come back far above." And the observation station commander, Rilo, watched the reunion unfold. He had known this day would come. He had predicted it in his reports, but seeing it happen was still overwhelming. "She brought others," Temmie said quietly as Rilo replied. "She did and more. Will come. This is the beginning, the real beginning." He watched as the human crew began unloading supplies. They set up temporary shelters and surveyed the Tarinas. The creatures circled around them, curious, but unafraid, already accepting these new visitors because one of their own had accepted them first in a few years. There will be a permanent settlement herein. A few decades, there will be a city in. A few centuries, this world will be indistinguishable from any other human colony, and we can do nothing but watch. Temmie nodded. That is the nature of things, serve. The humans are part of the galaxy now. They will keep spreading and building and growing. They cannot be stopped. They can only be understood. Rilo turned away from the screen for the last time. Then, let us understand them, he said. Let us study them and learn from them, because ready or not, they are the future, and we need to be prepared for what that means on the surface below. Yuna stood in the center of what would become her new home. Bomi was at her side. Her crew was working around her. The creatures were watching from the hills. Everything was beginning again. She thought about her grandmother and her mother and her father, all the knowledge they had passed down to her, all the skills and techniques and wisdom. She thought about the humans who would come after her, the children and grandchildren who would inherit this world, the generations who would build on what she had started. She thought about the future, and she smiled. This is what we do, she said, to no one in particular. This is what humans do. Build, we grow, we spread, we make every world our home, and we never ever give up. The sun set over Bellis for the first sunset of a new era. In the gathering darkness, Yuna walked toward her crew. There was work to be done. There was a world to transform, and she had all the time in the universe to do it. The story was just beginning, and it would be magnificent.